The church switched from Saturday to Sunday the week after the resurrection. That is the version most people have heard. Tidy, clean, fits on a bumper sticker. It is also not what happened. What actually happened took 300 years, involved 2 catastrophic wars, Roman emperors, and in the end, an official church council threatening excommunication against anyone still keeping Saturday. That last detail is the one that should stop you. If Sunday was the obvious apostolic norm from the very beginning, if the switch was so clean and so early, why did the church need a formal anathema 3 centuries later to make it stick? That question is what this investigation is about. The history of the Christian day of worship is not a story of sudden clarity. It is a story of decades-long friction, geopolitical pressure, and a community working out its identity under threat. And once you see how it actually unfolded, you will never read the early church the same way again. Before we go further, if you are not subscribed yet, hit that button. This is what we do every week, and I want you here for it. Start at the beginning, not the resurrection, before it. The first believers in Jerusalem were Jewish, not spiritually Jewish, ethnically, liturgically, observationally Jewish. They attended the temple, they observed the annual feasts, they kept the seventh-day Sabbath every week without question. Acts records that Paul himself, the apostle who wrote, "You are no longer under law, but under grace," used the Sabbath synagogue as his primary preaching platform. Not because he was secretly legalistic, because the Sabbath assembly was where you found the audience for the message. The earliest followers of Jesus did not think they were starting a new religion. They thought they were the fulfillment of the one they already had. That matters for everything that comes next. Now there is a genuine scholarly debate about what Jesus himself intended regarding the Sabbath, and I am not going to pretend it is resolved. The historian Willi Rohrdorf argued that Jesus' healings on the Sabbath, many involving chronic, non-life-threatening conditions that could have waited a day, were deliberate provocations, that Jesus was signaling something. The arrival of the kingdom of God had broken the old frame open, and the Sabbath's restrictive legal form was no longer the point. On Rohrdorf's reading, Jesus planted a seed of freedom that naturally grew into Sunday worship, rooted in the resurrection. Samuel Bacchiocchi, a scholar who devoted his career specifically to this question, argued the opposite, that Jesus was not dismantling the Sabbath, he was revealing what it was always for: mercy, healing, restoration. The Sabbath as salvation rather than restriction, and that the Jerusalem community's ongoing Torah observance after the resurrection confirms any shift toward Sunday was a later development driven by Gentile cities, not apostolic mandate. Both positions have evidence behind them. I am not going to give you a false resolution here. What I can tell you is what the historical record shows for the first several decades. The church was keeping Saturday, and Sunday was not yet a settled universal norm. Something had to change that, and it did. 2 wars. The first Jewish revolt began in 66 AD and ended with the Roman army destroying the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. That single event reshaped everything. The temple was gone. The sacrificial system was gone. The geographic center of the Jewish world had been reduced to rubble. For Christians in Rome and Alexandria, association with the defeated, humiliated Jewish community became a political liability. The Roman state imposed a special tax on all Jews across the empire, the fiscus Judaicus, meaning the Jewish treasury tax, and enforcement was aggressive. The Second War hit even harder. The Bar Kokhba revolt, which began in 132 AD, was crushed so completely that Emperor Hadrian renamed the entire province. Judea became Palestine. Jews were barred from Jerusalem, and Hadrian issued decrees specifically targeting Jewish practices, the Sabbath among them. In major urban centers, being identified as a Sabbath keeper was no longer just a religious statement. It was a financial and social one. At the same time, the Jewish leadership was doing its own gatekeeping. After the fall of Jerusalem, the rabbis reconvened at a town called Yavna to stabilize Jewish identity. There, they introduced a modification to the Amidah, the Amidah being the central daily Jewish prayer, the backbone of every synagogue service, adding a new blessing called the Birkath Hominum, which translates as the curse of the heretics. This prayer was designed specifically to make it impossible for Jewish believers in Jesus to continue participating in synagogue worship. If you confessed that Jesus was the Messiah, you could not recite the Amidah without effectively cursing yourself, caught between Roman hostility on one side and Jewish excommunication on the other. Gentile Christian communities in Rome and Alexandria began to develop a distinct identity, and the most visible marker of that identity was which day they gathered. Sunday, the day of resurrection, became the flag that said, "We are not them." Now, what do the actual 1st and 2nd century documents say? Because this is where most popular summaries either oversimplify or go wrong. The Didache, a Greek word meaning teaching, is a church manual dated to the late 1st or early 2nd century. It is one of the oldest non-biblical Christian documents we have, essentially a field guide for Christian communities in the apostolic generation. Chapter 14 says, "But every Lord's Day, gather yourselves together and break bread." That is clear enough. Sunday worship is happening. But notice what it does not say. It does not say every Lord's Day instead of the Sabbath. It does not say having abandoned the Sabbath. It specifies when to do the communal meal. The explicit replacement of Saturday is not in the Didache, but the beginning of organized Sunday practice is in the Didache. Ignatius of Antioch is more direct. Writing around 110 AD to a community in Magnesia, Ignatius praised those who were no longer observing the Sabbath, but living in the observance of the Lord's Day. That is strong language, but read why he felt the need to say it. Ignatius writes it because Sabbath observance was still widespread among Christians in his world. He is writing against Judaizing, a practice common enough to require his sustained attention. Ignatius is not describing the universal norm. He is arguing against the current reality. This is real quick. I want to be honest with you. About 90% of people watching this are not subscribed yet. If this investigation is doing something real for you, subscribing is the one free thing you can do to keep this research coming. I put serious work into these. Now back to where the theology gets interesting. In the 2nd century, Christian writers began building a full theological case for Sunday, one that went beyond "we meet on the resurrection day." The Epistle of Barnabas, written somewhere between 70 and 132 AD, argued that the current Jewish Sabbaths are not acceptable to God, but that the 8th day is. What is the 8th day? It is Sunday, but the name carries a specific argument. The logic is this. The Jewish week runs 1 through 7. 7 is the Sabbath, the completion of the first creation, the Creator's rest at the end of his work. Think of it like the closing paragraph of a chapter. Sunday comes after it is the 8th. And the 8th, Barnabas argues, is the beginning of another world, the world inaugurated by resurrection. Not the closing paragraph, the opening of the next book. Saturday marks the end of the old creation. Sunday marks the beginning of the new one. That is a genuine theological argument. You can feel its weight even if you find it incomplete. Justin Martyr, writing in Rome around 155 AD, gives us the most detailed picture of Sunday worship from this entire era. He explains that Christians gather on the day of the sun for 2 reasons. Because it is the day on which God first created light, the opening act of creation, and because it is the day on which Jesus rose from the dead, the opening act of the new creation. Notice something. Justin uses the Roman name for Sunday without embarrassment. He is making a case to a Roman audience, and he uses their calendar to do it. Which brings us to the solar cult question. And this is a place where I want to be precise, because the evidence here is genuinely contested. During the 2nd and 3rd centuries, sun worship was at its cultural height across the Roman Empire. The cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, and the cult of Mithras were woven through the military and through major cities. Some historians have argued that Sunday's rise was shaped in part by this atmosphere, that occupying the same cultural day as the sun cults made Sunday a more natural home for a religion seeking to displace them. Tertullian, writing in North Africa around 200 AD, had to explicitly defend Christians against the accusation of being sun worshippers. He admitted that Christians devote Sunday to rejoicing, but insisted the reason was entirely different from pagan veneration. The fact that he had to make that defense tells you something. The surface resemblance was real enough that outsiders noticed. But I want to be careful here, because direct liturgical borrowing from Mithras or Sol Invictus is highly contested. Most serious historians do not argue that Christians consciously copied pagan practice. The more defensible claim is that the cultural atmosphere made Sunday feel natural, and that this atmosphere did real work in easing the transition, particularly among converts from that world. Influence is not imitation, but influence is still real. Now, Here is the detail I did not expect to find, and it is the one that breaks the narrative of a clean universal transition. The Church in the East did not make the switch on the same timeline as Rome. The 5th century historians, Socrates, Scholasticus, and Sozomen, recorded this explicitly. With the exception of Rome and Alexandria, most churches in the known Christian world were still celebrating the Eucharist on the Sabbath. They were doing both. Saturday for prayer and scripture, Sunday for the communal meal. This dual observance was not confusion. It was a considered practice. The 7th day honors creation and the Creator's rest. The 1st day honors the resurrection and the new creation. Many communities saw no contradiction. Some kept both days for centuries. The Ebionites and Nazarenes, communities claiming direct descent from the Jerusalem church, kept only the 7th day, because that is what the Jerusalem church had done, and no one had told them differently. The picture this paints is not of a unified church that switched days cleanly after a shared apostolic decision. It is of a church where the day of worship was actively contested, regionally varied, and still being negotiated 300 years after the resurrection. Rome did not leave that situation alone. One of the tools the Roman Church developed to pressure Christians away from Saturday was liturgical, the Sabbath fast. Saturday was designated as a day of mourning and fasting. Sunday was a day of feasting and celebration. You could not fast and feast on the same day, which meant, practically speaking, you had to pick one. The Roman Church was doing deliberate liturgical engineering, making one day feel like grief and the other feel like joy, to shape which day Christians would actually choose. And then came the moment that clarified everything. The Synod of Laodicea, held around 363 AD, more than 3 centuries after the resurrection, issued Canon 29. Listen to the exact language, because it is remarkable. Christians must not Judaize by resting on the Sabbath, but must work on that day, rather honoring the Lord's Day, and if they can, resting then as Christians. But if any shall be found to be Judaizers, let them be anathema from Christ. Anathema from Christ for keeping Saturday. Sit with what this reveals. 330 years after the resurrection, the institutional church issued a formal decree threatening excommunication against anyone still observing the day the first believers observed without a second thought. This does not tell you who was right and who was wrong about the day, but it tells you with absolute clarity that the transition was not clean, not sudden, and not unanimous. It was a political settlement backed by an imperial church, written against a practice still common enough in the 4th century to require a formal anathema. Here is what I think the whole story actually reveals. The shift from Saturday to Sunday was not a corruption of pure apostolic Christianity, but it was also not a seamless fulfillment of an obvious apostolic intention. It was a community under enormous pressure, political, social, theological, working out what faithfulness looked like when the world around it was being demolished and rebuilt. And the questions that drove the transition are questions we are still sitting with. What does the resurrection change? What belongs to the old creation and what belongs to the new? How much should a community's identity be shaped by who it needs to distinguish itself from? The Sabbath mystery is not solved by picking a side in this history. It is opened by understanding what was actually at stake. And what was at stake was the identity of the community itself, who they were not, and which story they were living inside. If this landed for you, hit the like button, because that is genuinely how this research reaches people who need it. And I want to know where you are. Drop it in the comments, whether this changes something, whether you disagree with something I said, whether this is the first time you have encountered this history. I read them. The full research document, every source, every scholar, the full Rordorf and Bacchiocchi debate, the Canon 29 context, is on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Links are in the description.